Thanks for joining me tonight. This is an important topic. I know people don't like to necessarily focus on this. They'd rather talk maybe about, schools or, that's important too. Don't get me wrong, crime, whatever else. They kind of, they're so used to hearing that that Illinois is broke that it just sounds like a repeat of the last 10 years. But you know what? Illinois is broke. And here to discuss that with me is Sheila Weinberg. She's a CPA and the founder and CEO of Truth in Accounting, whose mission is to compel governments to produce financial reports that are understandable, reliable, transparent, and correct. Well, for the most part, Illinois fails a lot in a lot of those ways. They're certainly not understandable or reliable. They're not transparent, and oftentimes they are incorrect. But Sheila is correct. She's got it all down. And every year so far, they have been doing these, the Truth About Balanced Budgets, a 50-state study, and her new one just came out. Sheila, thanks so much for joining me on this program. You are an Illinoisan as well, which is even more important, in my opinion.
Oh, definitely. Thanks for having me on, Janie. And, it's a lot about numbers. And as you said, Illinois is broke, and people know that. But I think it's more important to think about it in relation to the balanced budget requirement. And the reason you have that is so the government doesn't spend more than they take in. But by using false numbers, the current governor and previous governors have been able to expand government beyond what the taxpayers are willing to pay for. And therefore, the taxpayers really cannot hold the governor or the other elected officials accountable. And if they had the true numbers, think about, and the budget was truly balanced, what the governor would had to have done to truly balance the last budget it was out of balance by between $5 and $10 billion. And if he had required to do the math correctly, then he would have had to raise taxes, which the voters wouldn't have liked, or decrease spending and certain benefits, which the voters wouldn't like. But by doing the math wrong, he's allowed to pretend the budget's balanced, and it makes it so the voters, go to the voting booth. He's saying the budget's balanced, I'm being fiscally responsible, and people make voting decisions based upon the wrong numbers and those wrong statements.
So when you say $15 to $10 billion unbalanced, are you specifically talking about the fact that they do not actuarially fund the pensions at the rate that they should, and instead use a statutory number that is typically $6 billion below?
Yes.
Okay.
There's other gimmicks that they play. And again, people are like, oh, the pensions aren't getting paid. But again, they're not really balancing the budget. And if he really had to balance the budget, there would be political consequences. But because we don't hold them accountable for this accounting, there's no political consequences for him.
Well, that's kind of the argument that they made in 1970 when they put in that pension protection clause, when they had that constitutional convention. And they essentially said, well, if we put this pension clause in where it says you cannot in any way impair the pensions, they thought at that time that the burden would be so ginormous that they would in no way overdo the pension obligations or confer benefits that they could not afford. And so they thought that this was a way to actually make pensions a reasonable number that would be on the books. And instead, what we got was monkey business that has ballooned our pensions to a huge amount and is the source of much frustration with SEC action against Illinois happening again for misleading pension disclosures. Now, that happened in 2013. Quinn got a slap on the wrist, should have got fined, got a warning. And are we back at it again? Are we getting a cease and desist order again from the SEC?
I believe the SEC, needs to. They protect the bondholders. They need to protect the taxpayers.
Yes.
And the bondholders, I believe, I'm an accountant, not an attorney, but I believe that the state is violating the cease and desist order. I believe that the state is violating the anti-fraud provisions of of the Securities and Exchange. And keep in mind, I used to think that it was because there was misleading statements in the bond offerings. But since then, the SEC has issued in 2020 a legal bulletin that said, no, it is not just the bond offerings. It's financial statements. It's press releases. It's the budget. And in the governor's last budget, he said he was fully funding the pensions. And as you and I, Jeannie, know, he is not fully funding the pensions. And he may be fully this statutorily requirement, but the cease and desist order clearly said, if you can go ahead and fully fund that statutorily requirement, which you just made up, and it doesn't really have anything to do with actuarial, sanity. But if you do that, you have to disclose how much you should have. And in the governor's 600-page budget, they did not disclose that. He just said we are fully funding the pensions. And I believe that the SEC needs to come in and charge them with securities fraud again.
Okay, well, let's stay on the pension system just really quick before we turn to your report. But the other big problem here is Pritzker signed this police pension bill that adds pressure for a state bailout and a city property tax hike. That's what the Sun-Times wrote as their headline. Them, who is like basically a union-owned organization, is admitting that this pension bill that he signed could cost $60 million more in 2027. And by 2025, city pension payments will be $750 million higher. Overall, I believe it's adding $11 billion to these unfunded pensions. And most egregiously, both police and fire pensions are now below 20% funded. And that is literally the definition of insolvent. And so he signed this bill and he pretended like it wasn't a big deal, but actually, or he pretended like he didn't understand how detrimental it would be to Chicago. But the backstory is that the emails revealed that he knew damn well that this was detrimental to Chicago. So not only was it a terrible bill to sign, but then he lied about not understanding it.
Yeah, but, I would push back. I totally agree with what you're saying, but, the Republicans voted for it.
It flew out of the House. That's right. Yeah, it was a unanimous vote.
This brings to mind what we're also pushing is in the 1970s, before 1970s, corporations offered their employees defined benefit plans, and they did not record them properly, and they did not fund them properly. So when Studebaker and others went bankrupt and their pensioner, they didn't have the money to pay their pensioners, the Congress stepped in and said and passed the ERISA, the Employee Retirement Insurance Securities Act, which required them to run them properly and disclose things properly and contribute things properly. And unfortunately, so since then, corporations have either started funding them properly or they have gotten rid of them and switched to defined contribution plans. Why haven't the governments done that? Because there was one line in ERISA that excluded state and local governments. And the rationale was, the governments always treat their employees well and will fund these properly. Well, since ERISA has passed, we have evidence, especially in Illinois, that they do not follow that good model. And we believe that ERISA needs to be changed and it needs to include state and local governments.
Oh, that would be a game changer for sure to put them on the dime to make sure that happens. In the meantime, yes, this bill flew out unanimously because they considered it a parity bill without realizing that Chicago police and fire don't pay as much in as downstate does. So there wasn't really any parity to discuss. That's part of the problem. Now let's turn to your report because your State of the State one, which is great, it tells you exactly what the taxpayer burden is per taxpayer in the state of Illinois. The money we need to pay our bills is $172.8 billion, according to your financial breakdown, and that equates to a taxpayer burden of $38,800. We rank 48th out of 50. You gave us a financial grade of F, and I know we're only one of 5 states to receive an F. What else can you tell us about your report?
Well, obviously the pensions are, the major part of that. The unfunded retiree health care benefits are also part of it. And the pensions, they may be setting money aside, but the Illinois Supreme Court said that the retiree health care benefits were just as guaranteed as the pensions, but the state does not set any money aside to pay those. The other thing that we found that was disconcerting is we looked at the federal aid coming to the states, and historically that runs below $750 billion for all the states. During COVID, that increased up to $1.5 billion. COVID is over, so you would think that the amount would go back to the historical level of, around $750 billion. But the federal government in 2024 still gave the states $1.2 trillion. So we believe, and we think the environment in Washington is, obviously cutting. And we did a study as, okay, if Illinois' federal funding went back to 2019 levels, adjusted for inflation, the money they would get next year versus what they got in the prior year would be $16 billion less, which would be 15% of the state's estimated expenses. The likelihood of that happening, nobody knows. I think it's pretty strong with the political environment in D.C. There's already budget constraints. What are they going to do if they lose 15% of their primary government expenses?
Oh, well, they're going to probably have to hike taxes because they don't want to cut spending in the state, which is what we need to do because he's increased the budget 40% over the 7 years that he's been there. And you've got a declining population. So it makes no sense at all.
And the other two things we found is, one, we're not using all the other states, there were only 7 states that had not issued their 2024 financial statement. The numbers I'm talking about are based on 2023 financial statements. They didn't issue their financial statement until 400 days past their fiscal year end. If a corporation did that, they would probably, IRS would be after them. They'd probably lose their, the Securities and Exchange Commission would be after them. They'd be they couldn't be on the stock exchange anymore. But Illinois, is notoriously late. The other thing is
hey, Sheila, we're going to have to leave it right there. I have a hard break. And so I want to thank you so much for coming on. We'll have you back on to discuss more of this because it's really important information. Sheila Weinberg with Truth in Accounting. Thank you.
Thank you.
Now,